Okay, thank you. All righty. And actually, this isn't too much on the Aswan Dam. This is actually going to be a story of my parents, Bill and Nancy Buckles, who lived here in Pueblo, and my father was a professor at the university, and they had the opportunity to actually go to the Sudan in the 1960s and work on the archaeology of the area before the Aswan Dam was built and before the whole area was flooded, because a massive amount of both historical and prehistorical sites were destroyed or buried. And Mr. Ian, I advanced the slide, but not the right slide is showing up.
You break it.
I broke. Oh, there we go. I have to. Okay, I see. It's showing the next slide. I've got all of this. I've got all this. So these are my parents, Bill and Nancy. My dad was a professor out at the university for 27-ish years, the head of the anthropology department out there. My mom was his sidekick. She never had a formal degree, but she served right alongside my dad for all of his years. She had both official and unofficial roles in all of his different projects. Officially, she cooked for a lot of his projects, sometimes cooking for upwards of 40 people on a Coleman stove. Then she was also lab supervisor, where she analyzed the artifacts, cataloged the artifacts, and then also, she wrote a lab manual that I believe is still in use of today, where she created a template so people could evaluate their artifacts and know what the uses are, the time period they were from, et cetera, et cetera. She also had unofficial roles of camp mom for all the different people, all the different college students that were working on my dad's projects, mom to my brother, my sister, and me, and confidant, and probably best of all, friend for everybody. So the archaeological survey of the Sudanese Nubia, that was the actual, and actually, let me backtrack for just a second. To come up with this presentation, because I was not alive when my parents went to Africa. I grew up with lots and lots of stories about their time. So what I did to create this presentation, I did some research on the survey of the area, but then I found kind of a treasure trove of letters that my mom wrote right after they returned from the Sudan. And so my presentation is more or less through my mom's eyes. I also, Georgine Booms had slides that most of them were from what my dad took when they were there in the Sudan, but then they also, Carla, she found this last night. One of the head of the whole University of Colorado project, his son was a 13-year-old, and he did a lot of the photography. So I don't know how many of the slides he actually took as well. So at any rate, this is kind of my interpretation. I've learned a whole lot about what actually went on there, but this isn't going to be necessarily archaeological. It's going to be a more personal tour, my mom's tour of their time in the Sudan. So at any rate, this was a massive project. What was happening is that both Egypt and Sudan, they were building what is called the High Aswan Dam. That is this one right here. The Lower Aswan Dam had been built in 1902, I believe, was when it was completed. But they wanted to build a larger dam in order to control the flooding of the Nile River, help with hydroelectrical power, and then just have a lot of irrigation. A lot of that actually was interesting, that I found that it has not proven to improve their agriculture, because the silt that the flooding brought in, the annual flooding of the Nile that brought in, is, well, at the bottom of Lake Nasser here, and it's not so the soil is not a fertile soil. And so unfortunately, the agriculture hasn't improved. So at any rate, the dam was started in 1960. The construction of the dam was started in 1960. And what would eventually occur is that whole area would be flooded out. This was a map that was one of the slides in my dad's collection, and all of this darker area, the Nile is the little squiggly line, of course, going down there. And then all of the darker areas, those were the lands that were going to be flooded out. And all of these dots are ancient sites. Not only ancient, but I mean, you probably could have filled this whole area with dots because there are also historical sites all along the way. So my parents, and I'll get to this in a little bit, they weren't working in Egypt. They were working down here in the Sudan, right around the Second Cataract, where Wadi Halfa, the town of Wadi Halfa, was. The other thing that I'll also say is all of the pictures that you'll see, again, these were taken in 1963, 1964. Everything is underwater now, of all the pictures that you'll see. One of the biggest features that my dad did not work on this, but one of the largest features was Abu Simbel. It's a 13th century temple honoring Ramses II. It was going to be underwater. So this is a water view of it. You can see one part of it there and part of it there. And it was going to be submerged. And so it actually was disassembled piece by piece and reassembled further inland so that you could go today and actually still visit it. And it apparently has held up very well from being disassembled and reassembled. This is a closer up view of this. With this, because the Egyptians and the Sudanese, they knew that all of these areas were going to be destroyed. So they actually applied to UNESCO and to receive funding and help with all of the archaeology on this. So everything would be recorded. And so it was a massive undertaking that took place. There were 3 different phases. There was the 1963-64 excavations. And then the next one was, I believe, 65, 66, and then a final one in 67, 68, I believe. And so this was a massive excavation that went, that it was a huge undertaking. This is part of that excavation at Abu Simbel. More than 20 different countries actually participated in the variety of excavations through the 1960s. The Polish team was one. They worked directly on Abu Simbel. Other countries that participated, Great Britain, China, Yugoslavia, France, the United States had multiple different groups that went. So the group that my dad and mom went with was the University of Colorado. My dad received all 3 of his degrees, bachelor's, master's, and PhD from CU Boulder. And so that's how he got to be a part of it. So this was, and I do not know if they participated in the later excavations, but they were there at least in 63, 64. So where actually a lot, not just the CU, but a lot of the different countries were based out of was Wadi Halfa. And so again, that is just, it's about 20 miles south of the Egyptian Sudanese border. And then most of their work was right around the Second Cataract, a series of falls and rougher water. And again, it's the city of Wadi Halfa. And so Wadi Halfa, and actually it doesn't exist like this anymore because it's all underwater. They actually did build a new Wadi Halfa that you could visit, but obviously in a different location unless you have scuba gear. So these are pictures that my dad or somebody on the whole trip took of Wadi Halfa. It was roughly about 50,000 people that lived in this area, but my mom did predict that it wasn't in the town as we see it right here. She thinks that it was a series of there were a bunch of different little communities up and down the Nile. And so she thinks that the population number came from all those little villages that assembled together. So this is an aerial view flying in and just a few of the houses. My mom said she thought it was probably about 15 blocks wide, but long, 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 long city. It was it sounds like quite the advanced city, because it was the head of the government for the Northern Territory in Sudan. And so you had a Hilton that you could stay there. That's my dad. I know he wasn't staying at the Hilton, but they must have visited. Lots of government housing. You had the taxi stand and the railway office in Wadi Halfa. You also had a lot of access. It was literally right on the Nile. And so a lot of water access. My parents actually, they got to Wadi Halfa on a steamer boat. They took a steamer from Cairo down to Wadi Halfa. So it's on a boat, something like this, that they arrived there. There's an airport in Wadi Halfa, a railroad that was near Wadi Halfa, and some paved roads around Wadi Halfa. Again, the waterfront, very, very active transportation system via the water. Apparently the fishing out of Wadi Halfa was pretty big as well. So now the actual work that my dad did. This is my dad in 1963, 1964. He was invited to go to work on this by Dr. Robert Lister, who was an anthropologist at CU Boulder and one of my dad's professors. And so my dad had finished up, in fact, he was finishing his master's while he was in the Sudan. He, in the letters my mom wrote, they sent his master's thesis, which was on the Ute prehistory project. They sent it back to be published for publishing from Sudan, and I guess it turned out to be an absolute mess, but that's okay. So his job in Wadi Halfa was part of the CU group. He was a foreman, field foreman, and then he also was part of writing the ultimate report at the end of their time there. So he was one of my mom. There were two different letters. She said 25 people from CU. Another letter said 27. I don't know if that only included students at CU that were working, or staff members at CU that were working on this project, or families, because there were families that went too. So this is just a collage of some of the people from CU that were working on the project. I don't have, because the slides that Georgine, there were a lot of captions on the slides, but not all of them did. So I don't have a lot of information about the actual work that was done. I know my dad, he wrote a biography of my mom, and she, in that biography, he had that the sites that they would be working on were everything from 500,000 years old to present day, being 1963, 1964. As far as the work, it was all, well, I don't know. Sometimes some of the pictures, you can kind of see Wadi Halfa in the background, but I don't know how close they lived to actually where they were working. But one of the pictures I found, which I think is a really cool picture, and I know for a fact that this is my dad because I know how he stood, they actually had to take a boat to get to wherever they were working on this one. I'm assuming that they're carrying, you could see some of the boat masts in the background, and carrying some of their work tools and whatnot to the work site, I assume. The workers, they actually trained a lot of Sudanese. Most of their work crew was from the southern parts of Sudan. And so that was one of my dad's responsibilities, was to teach them how to do the actual archaeology and the surveying and the excavating. This is part of the work crew on the site. And I thought this because I grew up in this environment on many, many, many different sites, and I was one of the excavators and whatnot. And when I first looked at these pictures, I thought, well, those are really lousy pits. But then thinking about it, they're digging in sand. So how can you have nice, crisp, clean walls and whatnot for this? So this, one of the things when this says C group site, in some of my research that I did, different groups of people, they named them, instead of having names like the Nubians or whatnot, they named them like C group. There was C group, X group, A group. I can't remember all the different letters. I didn't find any information why they named them that, but yeah. So this is a C group site for whatever that means. This is an X group site. It's a Christian settlement and a Christian church that was, I assumed, nearby this. And again, this is near the Egyptian border, but still in the Sudan. Part of their work was, of course, once you have the artifacts, is analyzing them, cataloging them. And this is Florence Lister. She is the wife of Bob Lister, who led the CU Corps. And this is kind of fun because this is kind of the role that my mom took on in later years, where Florence, she was a kind of an expert in the field of ceramic analysis. And my mom, even though in her letter she never talked about working with Florence, my dad referenced that my mom worked with Florence. And so that is some of the earlier parts of my mom's career in anthropology. And then this is one of the other students from CU, Kathy Green, also working in the lab. So that's pretty much all the archaeology, that, because I didn't have much information, but just the living there, because they were in Wadi Halfa for about 5.5 months. So this was a fairly long stay. And CU had a series of 3 different houses. There was a house for the bachelors, a house for the married people, which that include my mom and dad, and then a house for families, because there were families. I came across quite a few pictures of kids 4 or 5 years old that were there. So I mean, that, what a crazy, wonderful childhood that would have been. So this is a picture in front of the bachelor quarters, and I'm kind of thinking this is the street in front of there. I was looking at the doors and kind of the symbols on the doors, and I think this is the same door that is there. And I believe those are goats in the street playing, fighting. I'm not quite sure what they're doing. My mom said that they were lucky enough, the house for the married faculty, they actually had flooring. It wasn't dirt floors, and they had a cement patio. So it kind of sounds like they had the Hilton version of the whole setup. I'm guessing that this is the cement patio, and this is Gary Lister, the son of Florence and Bob Lister, that headed up the whole shebang. Then this is my dad. I'm assuming it was in the quarters that he and my mom lived in. So, and funny thing, this basket that looks like it's being used for trash, we used that as a trash can in my house growing up. So it continued its use. In the homes that they had, each home had a set of servants. And my mom, in her letter, she said, I hate to call them servants because that was far, far, far from what my mom's beliefs were. But by and large, it's what they were. They were all men. They had a cook, they had an assistant cook, they had a wash boy, and then they had a person who, I found the word suffragette, I believe that's how it's pronounced, somebody who waited on tables and cleaned their rooms. So these are just some of the pictures of the servants that worked in the house that my parents lived in. So Hassan was their cook, and Hassan, this I believe is Hassan. My mom wrote quite a bit about him because my parents, when they traveled, and that includes when we were growing up too, they always wanted the authentic experience. And so Hassan had cooked for the British Army during World War II. And so he actually spoke English. Each of the houses, one of the servants spoke English to help with the translation and whatnot. And Hassan was the English speaking person in the home. And he prepared meals for them in the English style, as my mom put it, because all in Hassan's eyes, all white people were English. And my parents asked and asked, would you please prepare some local kind of dishes? And my mom in her letter said that he would not, because those weren't proper for white people. So, but this was not in my mom's letters, but I grew up with the story of when they were living there, that they had brains and scrambled eggs for breakfast. And my mom, they complimented the cook on this because they loved it. And then they ate brains and scrambled eggs for another month. And so that was the story growing up. And finally, they asked that if he would please prepare something else besides brains and eggs. They ate lots of locally grown vegetables and fruits, lots of goat, lots of lamb, and as my mom put it, some very poor quality beef. And then they were very excited because a couple of times they got tinned ham, and so they were able to get tinned ham. This is Hassan's family. My mom wrote that he had 2 wives, and he appeared to be rather well off in the community. He had 2 wives, too many kids to count, and lots of grandchildren too. So that was my mom's words. So when they weren't working, they were able to do a fair bit of exploration. And being in a Muslim country, they had Fridays off because that's the Muslim holy day. And so every Friday they had off. And apparently, I'm going to guess that CU actually bought a VW bus that they could, the whole crew could use to go off and explore. And I don't know if this is the hotel that my mom referenced in her letters, but she said that there was a hotel in Wadi Halfa run by an Italian that you could go and get a nice cold drink and sit in the gardens. And so I don't know if this is that hotel, but the caption on the slide said, CU Volksbus at hotel, so I'm going to guess. One of the things my mom said, since she was leading a life of leisure, as she said, since she wasn't cooking, cleaning, or doing anything else, she loved to go to the souk, which is a shopping center. And most of the shops in the souk were actually owned by Lebanese, Syrians, and Egyptians. Very, very few Sudanese actually owned any of these shops. And a lot of the items in the shops catered towards Europeans and Americans because there were so many in that area working on with the archaeological digs. So these are just some. This is Gary Lister at the lemonade shop. My mom talked about all the wonderful, wonderful fabrics that she believed were brought in from Lebanon and other countries in the Near East, and then basketry in this shop. They also had, these were the meat and vegetable souks, and so it was just a great place to go. My mom often, she referenced going there often, and there were a couple of Lebanese brothers that took a liking to my mom and Gary Lister, because my mom and Gary hung out a lot, and they would stop and have tea there. And she said it was never easy to get away because they loved to talk. These are just some of the streets that they walked. My mom talked about she would hear music coming from somewhere, and so she would just follow the music to see where it was coming from, and she would end up at a doorway. And many, many times she was invited in. She saw a wedding. She saw a whole ceremony for a baby that after 40 days, a baby would have, if it was a boy, would have 40 cups of water poured on it. If it was a girl, 39 cups of water. She saw local dances, just a little bit of everything. So she liked to investigate. The other thing my dad referenced was going to a lot of soccer games, that the Sudanese were big time soccer players. So again, just some more street scenes. Another thing, camel rides. Again, that's a great form of transportation when you're living in a desert. My mom was she grew up on a ranch in Wyoming and was a wonderful horseback rider. And so she actually organized some of these camel rides. Some relatives of one of the servants in the house, they had camels. And so my mom organized these camel rides. And in her words, she said that riding a camel bears little resemblance to riding a horse other than you are sitting on the back of a 4-legged animal. So that That's what she said. Then they would, again on Fridays on their day off, they would take off. You could see the CU VW bus down there. They would visit other expeditions, their sites on their day offs. They would also read books, relax on their day off. And then one of the things my mom mentioned too, as they were driving out in the desert, were the mirages. And in her words again, she said, the mirages were something to behold. Driving along on the desert, and then all of a sudden you think you are going to drive right into the ocean because the whole place looks like one huge body of water. There weren't any pictures of mirages, although I looked one up online, and wow, yeah, it sure did. So just as Doug was referring to the play part of some of the excavations and big digs, this was a story that I heard many times, and I think I misspelled shard. I looked it up and it was spelled both ways. This is my dad, and this was Christmas 1963, and apparently they had quite a big party, and he ended up getting very intoxicated, and he was found, this is the sherd pile, he was found guarding the sherd pile, or at least that's what he told Bob Lister. And so an entire letter was written out complimenting him on his grand ability to guard the sherd pile, and then there was a beer bottle cap that was added to that, and that actually hung in the house for many years. I tried to find it. I don't know what I've done with that. That's my mom and Kathy Green. I don't know, the same Christmas party, playing the plates. I don't know what they're up to. Then finally, the souvenir that was brought back. One of the letters that my mom wrote, she kept on saying, I'm not going to bore you with all the details. I'm not going to bore you with all the details. Then came Charlie. And page after page after page after page describing Charlie. So Charlie was a puppy that the CU crew found abandoned in the desert. My mom in the letter said she thought that it was probably 3 or 4 days old. And so my dad brought it back to her, knowing her love of dogs, and my mom raised it, bottle fed it and whatnot, with intent of finding somebody to adopt it. Well, two things going on. One, everybody was going to be evacuated from Wadi Halfa because it was going to be flooded. And so who wants to take along a dog? Second thing, dogs weren't pets. They were pests more than pets. And so they ran stray on the streets. And so the end all was that if they couldn't find a home for it, and if they left Charlie, she would she would have been killed, because one of the things, the government of the Sudan, they actually paid to have all the essential animals such as camels, donkeys, horses, goats, sheep. They paid for those to be relocated along with the people when Wadi Halfa was eventually flooded. But with dogs and cats, they were shot. That was one of the things that the police did, was go around and shoot them. So at any rate, my parents, they're, as my mom said, the most expensive souvenir, because they actually had to fly Charlie back. My parents were traveling when their time was up in Wadi Halfa. They were traveling through Europe. And so Charlie had to be flown back to the United States and stayed with an uncle of mine. And that in itself was quite the task to get Charlie back. And so a lot of money was paid. A lot of it sounds like in bribery to get this dog back to the United States. We had Charlie. I don't have any memories of her. I was probably about 2 years old when she died. So that is the most expensive souvenir. She was called a Baladi, which is just a street dog. And then those are my parents in Cairo at the end of their stay. So that's pretty much it, the talk. I do have a few more slides, just I don't have any stories about them, but I'll just quickly kind of go through the rest of the slides. This is the airstrip in Wadi Halfa. So imagine landing on that and then a whole herd of cattle. One thing my mom said, they basically had interaction mainly with men, very few women. And with the women, a lot of the more traditional women had tattooed, their lower lip was tattooed blue, and then they wore the black clothing and head coverings and whatnot. None of these slides were labeled as to what those are. This is their time in Egypt with the pyramids at Giza and whatnot. And that is it. Okay. Righty. Next.
Good job. What do you think, Doug? We're really behind, folks. Bob Mack is next. On Cypress. I guess it's up to everybody. It is 8:30. So go for it. Yeah. Okay. Point me to the goal post. Go for it. I would like you to advance so I can be out here and use and have my own laser here.
That doesn't work.
Pardon?
That doesn't work. People at home can't see the laser.
Yeah, cleaning, I can see it.
People at home can't see it.
Oh, okay.
But so what's best is for you to point from here. What was the name of your presentation?
Do what?
What was the name of your presentation?
Oh, it's Cypress.
There it is, Cypress. It must be it. Okay. So what we can do is you can point with your pointer and I'll try to follow with the mouse.
Let's see, it's not, it must have been marked.
So
Do I have to wear these? Because my
Yes,
voice
so the
is
people
very-
at home can
okay,
hear you.
Zoom,
yeah,
Zoom,
Zoom,
doesn't matter which side this goes on.
it's better on this side. We found that out earlier.
Okay. It's kind of high, but I guess this will get there. Okay, thank you. You can set me up. First of all, really quickly, I'd like to thank Doug and the whole gang. This has been one of the best. We've been members for, I think, 13 years at least, maybe more. This has been one of the best organizations I've ever been with, including some anthropology associations, believe me, in terms of a whole bunch of things. So thank you very much. And for the membership in general. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Mr. Little because he helped see me through a very nice seminar he helped me set up in here on Saturdays about 2 years ago on forensic and bones and that stuff. So thank you, all of you. I'm also going deaf pretty fast, or at least losing an awful lot of my hearing. So probably be no questions. And that probably will work out for everyone so they can go home and go to bed or whatever, go home and get a drink or whatever you do. So this was originally in 2019 that we spent, my wife and I, Donna, spent about 3-4 weeks in Limassol, Cyprus. And then after this thing was passed, we went to Portugal, which we really, really loved. Please. This is the director of the project, Dr. Shania, and my wife, Donna, on the right, Dr. Shania. And she is a Cypriot. She is a Cyprus original for many, many generations. What I'm doing here is, well, it's pretty clear. There's a division here that's owned and controlled by Turkey with that green line drawing the northern part. And we sure found a lot of protests, big signs and stuff in the southern part, which is where we were controlled it's independent. They're independent, but they're much more closely tied to Greece. So it's Greek Cypriot controlled. You can see that this relationship of where it is in the far eastern Mediterranean has always been a target for major different groups of occupation. Oh my goodness. Well, hunters and gatherers settled it about 10,000 years ago, but it saw conquest by empire after empire, and a Turk, Alexander the Great conquered it, just on and on. The British had control of it as a province for 1925 on, and we still found a lot of British influence and that sort of thing in it. Most people, like a lot of other places that I've lived and been, Donna and I traveled, the younger people all speak quite well in terms of the English tongue, please. So this is where, with the arrow showing where we spent most of our time in the southern part in Limassol. Next, thank you. And specifically in Limassol, looking at remains, all came from St. Nicholas Cemetery. You will notice at a cursory look, and it's so packed, you could hardly walk between graves at all. You'd have to kind of walk on top of part of the stones because the soil is limited. It's very rocky, the whole island, and people bury their dead in the 3, 4, 5 deep. The burials we have are about 200 to 300 years old. They're not much older than that often, but people are retaining them now and taking them out because they haven't paid the rent, so to speak. Basically, it's pretty expensive to maintain, and so people are taking them out very quickly. Many of the younger Greeks and the Cypriots have been pushing for getting burned, get the bodies burned, and the Eastern Orthodox Church has been against it. But I just read about 6 months ago that it seems to have passed now, and the first crematoria is going to open by next fall, I think. So that'll help relieve some of this kind of pressure. Okay, please. This is Sania and I in the lab, which was on the cemetery grounds about 25 feet down. And we have probably close to 1,500, 2,000 skeletons now in there. Please. We were given, all of us, to study and work with. Some of those boxes you saw stacked, you get a box like this and you jumble mumble, but you'll notice that the plastic sacks are often related to all the foot bones, and there's a good reason for that if you try to order those in the right position, as well as wrist bones, or even in some ways more complicated. So we're given this and trying to put it together and learn from it, with a little help from my some graduate friends also that were over here to the side. There were some things that I helped get, had a little help on, particularly down here, not showing the foot bones. Please. So human skeleton remains, including teeth, which of recent times, teeth have become the bioarchaeologist or the osteologist's delight, because now the plaque and other things you get out of the teeth are pretty amazing, kind of like annual rings of growth, and you can get a lot of age stuff out of it, but also disease and health status. And in fact, yes, so we've been using that for quite a few years. The life history of the deceased, age, sex, those are some of the things you can quite clearly narrow down. Sometimes ancestry within a very broad category. There's so much of that is so complicated that many bioarcs don't even, or forensics even, kind of in Europe don't deal too much with it anymore. Health and disease, the dietary patterns, they show up on the kind of effects on the bone at different times. Also lifestyle and activity. I'm from Alaska, well, at least 31 years there full time, and we have a lot of bones from older times of people kayaking and throwing. You can tell handedness because of where the musculature attaches. It leaves little enthesiopathies, they're called, little places on the bone where those tendons got stronger and muscle were pulling on them like a weightlifter. You're going to get some kind of little ridges there and stuff like that. So you can, there's all kinds of stuff you get out of it. Assorted traumas, some things cure and get reabsorbed totally, but some things last most of your lifetime. Some injuries that show up on bone. Violence, growth and development issues, whether you're getting certain kind of poor diet, especially as a younger kid growing where your needs are so high, those are maintained to some extent in the teeth and in the bones. A guiding tenet is flesh always forgets, but bones remember. And in short, what I'm talking about is an osteobiography of a human skeleton. Please. This is just a couple examples I pulled out. Left femur head and the greater trochanter, which we feel when we go down our hip. You think that's your hip, but it's not. It's the greater trochanter on the femur. And that's on the left side here. Severe arthritic destruction. You can see the head of the femur is becoming eroded, perhaps also some bacterial infection. Porosity, just tiny little holes that start developing, lack of proper nutrients and age. Possible fracture right here, apparent subsequent fracture on the neck of the femur, please. And now we have a left femur and a right. You can see some of the same things happening there. I won't dwell on that. This is a swelling in the far end, or the distal portion, we call it, of a bone infection, bacterial infection that lies just under that shiny covering. If you've ever butchered animals or anything, you find that slippery, shiny cover, that's the periosteum. Below that, and transmitted by the blood work, because bone is anything but dead. Just hit your shins once in a while. You'll see how that's a live tissue. Anyway, thank you. And we'll just move along. This is a part of a particular part of the skull, probably a case of scurvy. Scurvy shows up, of course, because of the shortage of vitamin C. Hence limeys back in the English sailors. And they didn't figure that out really. They just start sending limes along, and fruits and vegetables, and limes kept better in 1795 and began to change a lot of the outcomes. They didn't really understand what was producing it all. And but what we find now is vitamin C, we know so much about this, is critical. It's critical for bone formation because it leads to the incredible development of this collagen, this flexible part of a bone. But it also is connected to all the connective tissue, blood vessels, capillary walls, those kind of things. And so, in fact, sometimes red blood cells go haywire because the fragility of the membrane needs a certain amount of collagen in it. It needs vitamin C to produce that. Now, to prevent scurvy doesn't take very much vitamin C, but I think it's something like 10 to 15 milligrams a day, but it's not stored very much. And as many of you know, primates, guinea pigs, and a few varieties of bats are the only critters around that require an intake of vitamin C in the diet. Other animals produce it. They make these kind of chemical changes, biochemical changes, and make their own vitamin C. So this leads to capillary bleeding if you don't have enough collagen there to produce enough bone, and you start getting these little small kind of porosity holes in them. This is we thought of about a 7-year-old or 8-year-old boy. We didn't want to take skull shots very much, so I don't think I have a skull of this, but it also shows up in other parts of the bone. And you might remember pictures of scurvy. It starts out right away with the gums are bleeding, and a lot of times old wounds that you had reopen when you're in bad shape with this. And of course, where you see one vitamin, mineral, or nutrient deficiency to this extent, you're going to find comortalities or other stuff going on. So often this is doubled up with iron deficiency anemia, a number of other things, particularly because vitamin C is also important in the production of hemoglobin or red blood cells. Thank you. This is Dr. Zania, and she's just holding up a vertebrae. And we'll go again and get it closer up. Extreme osteoarthritis, including what we call lipping. Well, that's pretty obvious, I guess. This is the, I got that. Yeah, right over, going down here, those osteophytes or bone spurs, we call, dipping down like that. And some of them kiss each other. So those are kissing osteophytes. Some are just lips, but when they match, we call those osteophytes, kissing osteophytes. Thank you. This again, identification, generally pretty highly accurate, is the sciatic notch. Narrow and deeper represents a male, and broader and less deep is female. And in this case, this is a male. Please, we're gonna roll. This is the front of the pelvis, where the two halves of our pelvis meet, called the pubic symphysis, or the pubic area, determining age. And if you look around, just run me around the inside of that white, yeah, it's kind of roughened, see along the edge. So this is not a very young person. A young person is very rich and smooth, and there are no borders on there and that sort of thing. And as we get older, yeah, it's part of the game. You start getting roughened up and that sort of thing. Eventually, if you get to be living old enough, for most people, it gets to be claw-like, almost. Okay, please. This is a foot, and very complicated talus bone. You know, it's three-dimensional puzzles or more. Just we'll just cruise on. By contrast, this is skeleton remains from approximately a 1+-year-old child, and remembering that babies, and this individual too, is pretty close to 300 bones versus an adult, which generally plus or minus some, 206 an adult. And of course, during growth and development, things fuse. If we go back to that, you can see how tiny those ribs are, and look at those vertebral bodies. They're all separated yet. They're not fused together into 3 or 4 parts, which I mean, into one part really, that we get later on. And look at those, you know, the small. It's very easy to lose those when you're excavating, of course. And a lot of people have just kind of put them in piles is all. Oh, please. This is the hyoid bone, which watching CSI or something all over your life. Yeah, this is actually something you can palpate real easy on yourself. Just go below your mandible and push in there a little bit there. So that's the hyoid bone just above your voice box. And that fuses later. So it's sometimes useful to determine ages too, although it's certainly not 100% because different people's age fuse at different times. Several horn, greater horn, there are different parts to all this. And then of course, people look at fracture, strangulation on that and that sort of thing. Okay. This was a case that I haven't seen very many. Spina bifida. It can be related to a folate deficiency or vitamin B9. Years back, it turns out it's somewhere in the late 90s, the US government specified that all cereals and number of foods that were common like that had to be fortified with folic acid, which is the supplemental form from folacin, which is rich in spinach and greens and a whole series of other things. Genetics, of course, so it's the usual suspects. It's congenital genetics. There's a great deal, fair amount of inheritance, but there's also this dietary sort of thing. And what it is spina bifida, literally translated, of course, is split spine by fida, two. So split spine. And the failure of the neural arch to close, and in this case, in the sacrum, this can occur anywhere in the lower, most likely in the lower part of the lumbar, and often in the transition between the lumbar and the sacrum. And you can see this is not near as wide as some. Now, these people, this may or may not have led to a shorter life. It's probably not severe enough, and probably was quite well enclosed in various kind of tissue covering it and that sort of thing. But in many cases, it does shorten life, and infections and mobility, depending where it is. Some of these show up as hernia-like, where part of the spinal cord is on the outside. It's because it's so open there, and it's like a little sac. It's nasty. Please. I just throw this in because there might have been one or two people in here that sat in my course I had here a couple years back, where we talked about in forensics, but the hardware in a femur that helps, that hardware in modern states or cities, if you want to say, or countries, you get all these are recorded, so there are numbers here if you're looking to get a body, and you can trace down, and those are required to be traced to what lab it came from, and the numbers. So that's one of the ways of identifying sometimes cases, forensic cases particularly. Please. And then finally, we had to cool off because it was over, what was done, over 100 in Fahrenheit degrees for days and days. And we would go out and look sometimes on the weekend at trying to see some sites, a lot of old sites there. But Donna would be in the shade waiting for me, and then I would be quickly joining her, and then we'd go get a beer or something. To tell you, hot. Something else, Donnie? Thanks for your help. I think I got one more.
Oops, sorry.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And so that's our group that I was with that summer. And I'm obviously the oldest guy. The guy next to me is Israeli archaeologist. A lot of good talks when we had a little time, which wasn't much. The first three in the front are all Americans from New Jersey. I forget what the other ones are from. Oh, the one on the far right below me is from, well, let me see, Lebanon, might have been Lebanon. And some of the other girls in the back, I know they're from Estonia. So people came from all over. It was a really neat experience. And they've been doing this now for about 7 years now. I think we have one, and that's it. So I thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
We have to adapt, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, that's all right. All right, that's it.